I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Today we have our System Planning and Renewable Energy Zone team presenting to you. We've got Melanie Kerner, who's the General Manager of the team. We have Shira Samocha, who is our Modelling Manager. We have Daniel Collins joining us from IIO, who is the Manager of Sector Coupling in the System Design team. And we also have the rest of the team available for any questions that require a specific specialty to respond to. So please ask questions far and wide. With that, I will throw across to Melanie.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome everybody to our third Draft IIO deep dive. To start off, a short introduction to IIO services for those of you who may not be so familiar. So IIO services, our purpose is to provide independent expertise to transform the energy sector. We were created as an independent subsidiary of IIO, and specifically our foundational role is to provide services to New South Wales under its electricity infrastructure roadmap, and we act as the consumer trustee under that policy. Today we're talking about one of our functions as the consumer trustee, which is the preparation of an infrastructure investment objective report, which is then used to guide our tenders for long-term energy service agreements. So our draft 2023 IIO report was published on the 16th of May. And that set out our draft development pathway and updated 10-year plan, which we intend to take forward. We've then since run a number of deep dives. We ran the first one on renewable energy laws and consumer costs deep dive earlier this week, and today we're running a deep dive on scenarios and sensitivities. This deep dive that we're running today is a little bit different from the previous two, which were more sort of IIO services informing our stakeholders around how we intend to develop VRE lull analysis and how we've developed consumer costs. But today we're really looking for to consult with this group to get your input onto the scenarios and sensitivities we might take forward in our final 2023 IIO report. So after consultation closes on this draft 2023 IIO report on the 30th of June, we then set up our scenarios and sensitivities and undertake the modelling to inform the final 2023 IIO report. So we're really at the beginning of the process, and we have an opportunity to change the scenarios and sensitivities from those that were presented in the draft report. And we are really looking for your feedback today. So welcome suggestions, welcome hands up if you wanted to make a suggestion or provide feedback on any of the content. And of course, any questions or suggestions in the chat are welcome as well. So objectives, we want to share information on the methodology and use of scenarios and sensitivities that we've been thinking about for the final IIO report and what we've done, as well as what we've done previously. And then we want your input on the appropriateness of scenarios and potential variables to test in the context of our New South Wales role for the final IIO report. And then we'll have 5 main sections to the agenda on why use scenarios and sensitivities, the way scenarios and sensitivities are generally used, how we've previously adopted scenarios and sensitivities in other reports. And we'll also hear from Dan Collins from IIO to talk about a little bit about where IIO's scenarios are heading for its 2024 ISP. And then we'll talk about our future approaches and our initial thinking around how we might treat scenarios and sensitivities for the final report, and then looking forward to your feedback. So I'll hand to Shira, who will talk through the bulk of the content today. Thanks, Shira.
Thanks, Melanie. So starting off with why we use scenarios and sensitivity, I'll start off with a bit of context on IIO services planning function to sort of give people context around how scenarios and sensitivities could be useful for our planning function. So maybe just going to the next slide. Thank you, Elizabeth. So to give some context around the planning function, we've got this infrastructure investment objectives report, as Melanie and Elizabeth mentioned, the draft of which we have recently published and we are currently consulting on. The purpose of these reports are to outline a 20-year development pathway for generation, long duration storage and firming infrastructure that is necessary to meet our minimum legislated objectives over the next 20 years and to minimise New South Wales consumer costs. The other component is the 10-year tender plan around how we're going to operationalise this development pathway through competitive long-term energy service agreement tenders. And so that the draft report presents a draft development pathway and draft 10-year plan, which will be updated in the final 2023 IIO report, which we will be publishing in December this year. As I mentioned earlier, the objective of the modelling in creating these long-term plans is minimising costs to New South Wales customers, which is a key component of our planning function. And that's around how do we determine how much infrastructure across generation, long duration storage and firming, and sort of the timing of that infrastructure is required in order for us to meet to minimise consumer costs and also meet our reliability and energy security target objectives across the 20 years. And as I mentioned, it is a 20-year forecast, so it's long term, but we do update it every 2 years. Although it might be more frequent than that if there is interim reports, such as the 2022 IIO report, which was a firming infrastructure investment objectives report per ministerial direction. There are in the modelling that informs these reports a lot of modelling that rely on a lot of different assumptions, some of which are quite uncertain. As I mentioned, it is a long-term plan, and it sort of is dependent on these assumptions that we're making today, which are quite uncertain, and some of which we don't have a lot of control over. And so the approach that we'll talk through today is how can we use the most likely set of assumptions to set a development pathway in a central scenario, but also utilise sensitivities to test the impact of certain factors on our planning function. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. Thank you. So just in terms of the importance of scenarios in planning, and we'll talk about this in detail today, is the purpose, maybe just more around the purpose and some of the key principles of our IIO report is we set a development pathway in order to deliver affordable, reliable, secure and sustainable electricity for New South Wales customers. There's lots of things to consider in setting a development pathway to achieve those objectives. And the development pathway, as we've presented in the draft 2023 IIO report, is based on our view at the time of modelling of sort of assumptions and scenarios that are broadly consistent with AEMO's 2022 ISB step change, which are sort of our view at the time of the most likely outcomes. The reason why, I guess, some of the key features of this report is that it's intended to be a long-term timeframe to give certainty, given that these investments are long-term investments, and it does have real applications in terms of how we then conduct our tenders, the cadence of those tenders, and the indicative tender sizes for long-term energy service agreements to give effect to those development pathways. It is, as I mentioned as well, really a really key feature of that is we're looking at long-term consumer interest by looking at how we can develop our plans to minimise consumer costs. But the use of sensitivities and scenarios is really important for us in terms of enabling us to understand the resilience of the plans that we're creating under central scenarios. There's lots of key uncertain external variables, so understanding the impact of them on how we plan for the infrastructure across those 20 years, or the impact of sort of those uncertain variables on consumers if we maintain that central plan, is a really key important feature in sort of testing the resilience of the plan. And some key variables that we might want to consider that are sort of in the context of our planning function within New South Wales is around things like the timing of transmission infrastructure or the retirement of large existing generators or demand side factors. But these are the kinds of things we'd like to hear from you later today. Next slide. So apart from it being really important for our decision making and us recognizing that and testing the resilience, it's also a legislative requirement for us. So in the IIO reports, we do need to take into account multiple different scenarios that enable us to analyze the resilience of outcomes to consumers in terms of the costs to consumers and the reliability outcomes based on the development pathway under different scenarios, and that is something that we need to do apart from wanting to do. Next slide, please. So what I'll just go through now is some ways of thinking about how scenarios and sensitivities can be useful. There's lots of ways to approach it, so we'll just outline to set the scene some of the ways that we've been thinking about it. So, as I mentioned before, a central scenario is sort of the way that we've been setting, well, at least in the 2023 draft IIO report, and also as we intend for the final IIO report, we do have a sort of central scenario that describes the development pathway, and the development pathway is based on that central scenario, which describes an ability for us to minimize consumer costs under the assumptions that we make that we think are the most likely, and sort of using the best and latest information. Scenarios and sensitivities are sort of two different things that we think about. Scenarios are around investigating an entirely different future of lots of different types of assumptions, or sensitivities where we're testing variable to inform how the plan might need to change to continue to achieve the best outcomes for consumers, or for what the impact to consumers would be if the plan was maintained. So those are two slightly different ways to think about it. And so if we go through this table, a sensitivity, it can be used to sort of either determine how a central development pathway, which was designed on the most likely set of assumption, performs in relation to a key uncertain external factor. For example, if we change the timing of a key project, or the retirement date of a key project, or sort of a key demand side factor. Or it would be if that factor was to eventuate, this sensitivity would help us determine how we might need to change the optimal development pathway to given that uncertain factor eventuating or occurring. A scenario is a bit broader than that, and it looks at an entirely different future. And so, for example, how would a development pathway that's based on a central set of assumption perform in terms of its impact to consumers against an entirely different future? What would the impact to consumers be? Or, for example, how would it need to change, and how would we need to adapt the way that we plan for different types of infrastructure against an entirely different future? And so some of the key questions that these factors would help us answer is, for a sensitivity, as I mentioned, it's around changing a key uncertain variable. For a scenario, it's around changing a majority of input assumptions to create essentially a new future to assess. The top left-hand side box question, where it's a sensitivity with maintaining the development pathway, would be answering questions such as, what is the impact to consumers of our plan, of our central plan, or the development pathway that we set under central scenario, if this factor was to eventuate? If we are going to the top right-hand side box, it's around how would we adjust and pivot the way that we plan for infrastructure if this factor was to eventuate. The bottom left-hand side box is around what's the impact to consumers of our plan if the future was fundamentally different to what we expect today. And the bottom right-hand side is around how would we need to adjust and sort of pivot the way that we're planning if the future was fundamentally different to what we're expecting under sort of the most likely, the central view of assumption. So there's sort of nuanced differences around how we might want to set these depending on what questions we deem to be the most important to inform our decision making when it comes to planning. So just to give some context to the audience today around what we've done previously, the way we've approached sensitivities and scenarios in the past has shifted and changed and developed. We have published a few different infrastructure investment objectives report, the first one being the 2021 report. We've also then had more recently the draft 2023 IIO report, and there was one in between around the 2022. So I'll talk through two examples around how we've approached it previously to set the scene around how we're thinking about it in the future. So starting with the first IIO report, the approach we took then is quite different to what we've most recently published in the draft 2023 IIO report. We actually considered 4 different development pathways under one core set of future assumptions or future scenarios that broadly aligned at the time with the step change scenario of the draft 2021 ISR. The development pathway that was selected was the supply chain adjusted development pathway based on its performance against a number of different criteria, including cost, reliability, emissions, and resilience. The key difference between these 4 is that the supply chain adjusted scenario was sort of this quite linear development of renewable energy to meet our minimum objectives by 2030. And that was sort of to reflect the fact that bulky or lumpy development might be challenging given the supply chain constraints. We also tested what if we back-end the development pathway for generation towards the minimum objectives in 2030, which was late, or front-end, which was early, so if we build it quickly and early, and res-aligned, which was sort of more lumpy and more aligned with the assumptions that we were making at the time around the timing of res network infrastructure projects. So that was the approach we took at the time, a single scenario, and the variable adjusted was actually the key output of interest, which is the development pathway itself. The approach we've taken in the draft 2023 IIO report is quite different. We had the central scenario, which is the basis of setting the development pathway. And this scenario was largely aligned with the step change scenario of the 2022 ISP, which was at the time of modelling our best view of sort of the most likely set of assumptions. But we then tested 3 other futures. The no coal by 2030 with strong electrification scenario was quite aligned with the hydrogen superpower scenario of the 2022 ISP. And so this scenario is fundamentally a different future than the central scenario and involves changes to the majority of the assumptions. And I guess that what that was answering is how does the development pathway change and what is the impact of consumers across how does the development pathway change across generation, long duration storage and firming, and what's the impact of consumers from that change if the future was fundamentally really different? Whereas the transmission delay and the early coal exit were more looking at key variables of interest that are uncertain in terms of if the future assumptions are largely consistent with the step change scenario, but key transmission projects are to be delayed, or key coal generator units from Bayswater in this particular instance were to be brought early. What does that? How does the development pathway for generation long durations change from those external factors, and what is the impact to consumers of those factors as well? And so that was a bit of a combination of scenarios and sensitivities. And to put it back onto the matrix that I sort of went through earlier in the next slide, what you can see is that if we were to look at the way that the 2021 IIO report was done, that was around sensitivities on varying the development pathway itself. And those sensitivities were the develop early, develop late, or develop res aligned. Whereas the 2023 draft IIO report was looking at both sensitivities and scenarios around re-optimizing the development pathway. So it was the early coal and transmission delay were more sensitivities where we're testing a key variable of interest, whereas the no coal by 2030 and strong electrification was fundamentally a different scenario. And of course, the 2022 ISP tested a range of different scenarios itself. I might pass over now to Melanie to talk about how we're thinking about scenarios and sensitivities in the future.
Thank you, Shira. So we have learnt a lot from the previous scenarios and sensitivities, and now thinking about what might be most fit for purpose for our final 2023 IIO report. So the 2021 analysis that Shira presented, that we changed the development pathway and we tested that development pathway. And the reason we did that is because at that point we were very focused on the 2030 deadlines and should we front end or back end the investment to deliver on that. Since that time, the degrees of freedom around that development pathway have really narrowed, such that we don't have many options to 2030 about how we're going to achieve our targets, particularly for generation. And so we have now moved on from that approach. The draft 2023 IIO report, we used scenarios analysis, four very different futures, or at least two very different futures. And that was sort of useful at the time, especially because it fed into EnergyCo's network infrastructure strategy. But for us, the really interesting scenarios were the ones that had small deviations from the central case to help us understand how we might pivot our tenders and our planning if those changes were to eventuate. And the all coal exit strong electrification scenario was less helpful to us, although very helpful for EnergyCo in thinking about their transmission planning under the network infrastructure strategy. So thinking through all that, I guess we're now starting to work up an approach to the final 2023 IIO report where we want to, I think, depart from those sort of four scenarios of the future. What we're thinking of doing is to develop have a central development pathway based on the most likely. So that's there in the first dot point, that we intend to set out a development pathway for generation, long duration storage and firming on the basis of the most likely scenario, or our view about what that most likely scenario is at the time of the modelling. And then that most likely then informs our tender plan. But then instead of running multiple scenarios, sorry, just go back, thank you, that we intend to run at this stage sensitivities where we're changing so one variable or variables that we think are most important to how we need to, that might inform our tender processes so that we can pivot if those external factors do eventuate. And I think why we've sort of come to this point is that the IIO report is not a transmission plan. So for transmission planning, it's important to understand a broad range of future scenarios so that these large, lumpy investments that correspond to transmission, that they can be made in a way that, in a least regrets way, should those future scenarios eventuate. But that's sort of less appropriate for our IIO report, where we're really concerned with procuring generation, long duration storage and firming, where we have, it's a little bit more flexible and we are able to adjust a lot faster if compared to transmission investments if we see those scenarios eventuating. So our principles that we're intending to take through and we'd like feedback on is that we do want to leverage AEMO's work through the 2024 ISP and the IASR approach being led by Dan in terms of the scenarios, and align with the latest input assumptions and methodologies that AEMO do develop in time for the 2024 ISP. But then rather than adopting a broad range of scenarios, to then focus in on the sensitivities that really target the variables which we think are most important within the New South Wales context. So this chart here just shows sort of our current thinking. The circles with dotted lines they're just sort of suggestions at the moment, but nothing's locked in. The only sensitivity that we know that we will do is the sensitivity of the central development pathway to VRE lulls, and that was discussed in our VRE lull webinar, where we'll be testing the development pathway to what we identify as the worst case wind and solar lulls across a longer 42-year period. So then we'll have a few examples there of things that we could test in sensitivity. So what would the development pathway so we start with the most likely scenario, and then how would the development pathway need to pivot if there were transmission delays, if there was an earlier exit of a large coal unit, how would offshore wind targets impact that development pathway, or higher DER or CER, or higher sort of distribution scale, solar in particular. But really interested in understanding views of the others in this room. So before we go to the discussion, I'm going to ask Dan to just speak through where AEMO's at in terms of developing its scenarios, which we intend to sort of leverage for our final IIO report.
Great, thanks very much, Melanie. If one of you could wave to show that coming through loud and clear. Okay, thanks, Shira. All right, so Dan Collins, I'm on the AEMO team, and what I'm about to present is the scenarios that have been developed through the stakeholder consultation in the IASR, that stands for Inputs, Assumptions and Scenarios report. So the draft of that was published on December the 16th, had around 70 submissions to that, and we're working through to the publishing of the final on the 28th of July. And just to spell it out, I guess the scope of the IASR is for the NEM, the National Electricity Market. So that includes Queensland, New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. Great. All right, apologies if any of you have seen this before. I'm going to spend about 5 or 6 minutes on the main slide, and then I want to talk to the process of understanding the most likely scenario. So on the horizontal axis here, we have energy sector contribution, which I guess is really, a very high level concept. But another way of thinking about the horizontal axis is really the many factors which can differ between these alternative worlds that could eventuate. And I'm talking about economy, I'm talking about technological development, the strength of supply chains, the degree of cooperation at national and international scale, and of course social license. Social license being really critical to the energy transformation. And on the vertical axis there is decarbonisation. I think that should speak for itself. All right, I'm going to start on the left and just talk to progressive change. So progressive change, there are some indicative global warming by the year 2100 outcomes associated with these three scenarios. So clearly it's the least desirable outcome, but it is important to test. The scenario does explain a world where those factors I've mentioned, such as the economy and supply chains and so forth, are at their low end of the scale, and that scenario is compliant with the federal government's Paris agreement, and each of these scenarios has got a carbon budget that it works to, which is associated with the temperature change there. All right, moving on to green energy exports. I guess the narrative behind this one is, as the name suggests, very robust economy where Australia is a leader in the energy front internationally, and there's the export of hydrogen and potentially other related fuels. And there's very fast decarbonisation, and it's essentially the view where it's the maximum or the best of everything, with hydrogen playing a big part of that. Now, the centre one step change is, I guess, as has been mentioned several times, it is related to the 2022 ISP, and at that point, step change was the most likely scenario, and I'll speak shortly around the process of of understanding which scenarios are most likely. But it includes a high level of CER orchestration. So CER orchestration is the essentially the buy-in from consumers regarding not only taking up PV and distributed batteries, but really sharing them, so to speak, in terms of signing up to programs like virtual power plants and getting involved in demand side participation and all those really important things that are very powerful. All right, let me go on to now talk about the yellow triangles, which represent the sensitivities. So just like Shira has described the value of sensitivities for the IIO, we also see them as highly valuable for the IASR and the broader ISP. So there is a sensitivity about reduced energy efficiency. So just to be clear, the step change does include a good degree of energy efficiency, and the purpose of this sensitivity is to see what happens in the absence of that expected level of energy efficiency, because it's through understanding the absence of it and those impacts that we're really clear on the risks, and we're also really clear on the value that energy efficiency brings. And conceptually, it's quite similar with the CER orchestration. So that lower yellow triangle there is meant to understand the risks that eventuate should consumers be less excited by the opportunity to have their DER orchestrated, and it also has that function of being really clear on the value of CER orchestration by testing its absence. Diverse energy resources goes in a different direction, and looking a bit more broadly than purely electricity and pure electrification. It is a consideration of what happens if biomethane replaces natural gas use, and industry finds it harder to decarbonise some of their industrial processes. So there was a number of stakeholders who saw a lot of value in exploring that matter. And then finally, rapid decarbonisation. I guess that addresses the feedback that a lot of stakeholders gave, that they're really keen to understand what a extremely strong response by the energy sector is, and it sits there as a sensitivity rather than a scenario, because amongst that feedback was, I guess, a variety of views on the role that other sectors of the economy. So I'm talking about agriculture, I'm talking about land use. So there is a need to decarbonise outside the energy sector, and there was a range of views on how that might happen. So I guess this sensitivity is to adopt the carbon budget from green energy exports, i.e. the most constrained carbon budget, the one that has this highest aspiration, and apply it to this sort of central economy and more sort of moderate view of the world in step change, and see how that plays out and what the implications of that are. So that's been my quick summary of rapid decarbonisation as a sensitivity. I'll just speak briefly now to the process of understanding the most likely scenario. So although these scenarios are now developed and they're being documented for the final IASR to be published in the 28th of July, the process of determining the likelihood of these scenarios hasn't been executed yet. So in the past, AEMO has used a Delphi panel process to understand those likelihoods. So what a Delphi panel process is where an expert panel is put together, and I'm talking about energy industry, I'm talking about consumers and their representatives, and of course government. And with those experts in the room, the Delphi panel is a way to make sure that every voice is heard equally, and they sort of iteratively share information and come to that understanding that results in the probability of each scenario. And once the probability of each scenario is known, then it's just pick the largest one is the most likely. So I'll let the next speaker go on, but happy to take questions on that.
Thanks, Dan. We do have one question that might be worthwhile you responding to at the moment. The question is from Boyd Pedersen. What does the horizontal dimension here mean, and what is the midpoint?
Okay, thanks, Boyd. So the factors that I mentioned in economy, technology, supply chain, cooperation, and social license, that is another way to understand the horizontal axis. So the progressive change is a world where all of those factors are at their low end, and the green energy exports is where all those factors are at their high end. So the midpoint being step change is essentially the midpoint of those. I think probably the only variation to that I would say is that step change does have intrinsic to its narrative a good degree of consumer buy into consumer energy resources and the orchestration that goes with that. And so
yeah, Boyd's got a follow-up question. So the two dimensions are collinear then?
Well, yeah, I mean that is exactly the question. So all those factors that I mentioned, certainly they help the energy transformation. If you have a good economy, if you have rapid technological development. So yeah, that's why we have that clear sort of linear pattern of the scenarios. However, as is shown by the rapid decarbonisation sensitivity and where it sits, the decarbonisation, as I mentioned, is more than the results of just the energy sector. And so, once again, those other sectors of the economy, agriculture and land use, and there are others, they have a role to play in the decarbonisation that Australia achieves, and that's why that rapid decarbonisation sensitivity, is a really important one to include in our sensitivity set.
Thanks, Daniel. Melanie, I'll throw back to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Elizabeth. So we're now up to question time, and we've got quite a few coming in already, but we've set out some questions here where we did really want feedback. So do you agree with our approach to adopt the most likely scenario for the development pathway? What are the important factors or variables that we should consider in planning and therefore should potentially lead to sensitivities? And should we consider the same sensitivities that IIO is expecting to consider around rapid decarbonisation, low CER orchestration, reduced energy efficiency, and diverse energy resources?
Thank you, everybody, for your fantastic presentations. Now, Boyd, if you're willing and or able, are you happy to jump on screen and ask your question? Otherwise, I am happy to read it out. We'll start with your comment earlier. If he's around, he'll jump off, but I'll start until then. The biggest scenario missing is one that is not purely supply-led. Why are there never any scenarios where demand flexibility is considered? Both UK and California have started to build flexibility markets. The amount of overbuild and hence potentially stranded capital and government subsidies required could be dramatically reduced with sufficient demand flex. Boyd, is
that's the question. No, I get where you guys are going, and the question about the scenario planning was, a bit of a setup. I think you guys, as an input to the ISP, really can't do scenario planning. The whole idea of scenario planning is to, imagine different worlds that could possibly happen. And, you can't plan a build of infrastructure for all different scenarios. You have to kind of pick one path and say, what are the variations along that set of dimensions? But it is unidimensional as you've laid out. One of the dimensions, though, that isn't being considered, as a taxpayer here, is the ability to be able to orchestrate demand. As we're seeing energy prices at the retail level creating significant signals for people to be able to make change in their own life and their own behaviors, it would seem likely that one of two things is going to happen. One would be unbundling of the retail prices, so people starting to actually choose flexibility as a secondary service, or secondarily, the government and the market being able to create a flexibility service that people can bid into, like what's happening in California. And that applies or is more attractive to users that want their power to be just like it is today, which is, let me buy it once and go back to sleep. So I don't see any of the models that have been selected here in Australia from any of the regulators to consider flexibility markets as a potential dimension, which would be actually or an orthogonal scenario to what you've chosen.
Does Shira, Melanie, Daniel, were you wanting to provide any comment to that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your point, Boyd. I agree that demand side participation is critical to getting this energy transformation right. Simply because it can be an extremely cost-effective way to to decarbonize and to give us the energy system we need. So demand side participation is a component of the forecast across each of the scenarios in the IASR, and there's actually AEMO has I'll call it a survey for every energy retailer and aggregator. Now it's a compulsory one, so they're all required to respond in detail with all the DSP programs that they have, and all the mechanisms and the number of customers and their aggregated side. So yeah, I can absolutely say that the IASR scenarios do include DSP forecasts, which we've had stakeholder feedback on, and are based on that wealth of detail that has come from all the relevant organisations.
Can I just add to that as well, that AEMO Services is currently running a firming tender, and that was as a result of a ministerial direction after the announcement of the Eraring coal-fired power station and the subsequent identification of a potential breach in the energy security target. In that tender, we have allowed demand response to participate in that tender, and that's demand response that is that also registers for the wholesale demand response mechanism. So that the wholesale demand response mechanism already exists. Currently, it's only limited to large-scale demand response, so commercial and industrial type facilities, as opposed to aggregation of small-scale demand flexibility, but that may evolve over time. And if so, and as soon as demand response, small-scale demand response becomes eligible for the wholesale demand response mechanism, then it theoretically will be able to participate in any future firming tenders that we do hold. So it is evolving, and I think that at some point in the future there will be the ability for small-scale demand response to participate in sort of schemes like this.
Thanks, Melanie. And I've just realised that I probably haven't emphasised one great development in I guess the broader piece around demand, participation and response, which is electric vehicles. I mean, electric vehicles are growing incredibly rapidly, and through the IASR process and the involvement of consultants who sort of specialise in electric vehicles. We've been able to identify a number of different charging profiles, and of course, some of those charging profiles acknowledge the value that exists in terms of having smart tariffs and shifting load, and I guess buying into programs that coordinate that EV charging. And so that is certainly also something that is part of our forecast.
Great, thank you. Now, Warwick, I can see that you've taken yourself off, you put your camera on. So are you happy to pose your question to the panel?
Yes. Hello. Well, firstly, can I say thank you very much for this opportunity to engage. And I'd just like to put on the table, if I may, my experience about what's happening on the ground. I'm dealing with helping steer local government in the Central West Orana RES. And in particular, there's $11 billion worth of generation and transmission projects, which I'm engaging with on a day-to-day basis. And also engaging with landholders in relation to the main transmission line that needs to be built. It seems to me, as I've said in my questioning there, that there are real issues coming to the fore now around cost increases with the generation projects, and allied with that are the costs associated with the non-refundable bonds and the like that those entities have to make to ENCO, complicated by the uncertainty is when the main spur line, the transmission line, will be built there. And we've recently seen the New South Wales Government Minister, Energy Minister, push out the date for the transmission line. It just seems that what I'm hearing and seeing on the ground is there's huge risks around the cost structures, and equally critically is about, as the Energy Minister has recently articulated for New South Wales, what's in it for them? That's the question being asked by rural communities. What is in it for them? So I think there's more work to be done to overcome the risk of delays. The challenge is to bring along and that the benefits need to be considered by the communities, the host communities, to be adequate. So I think that is a major issue, and I think we're locked on the horns of the dilemma. You know, how many benefits do you provide? Who's paying for those benefits? How many delays can we afford before blackouts start? And, you know, what are the implications then politically? I think it's a very challenging picture that's now coming to the fore. And equally, I think a critical factor here is the government, the fundamental state government architecture needs to be buttressed and reinforced, because I think at the moment we've underestimated the scope and extent and the complexities of what's involved in delivering this transformation. So I just put those things out there as a risk factor, and you know, just some ground truthing of what's happening, you know, out there.
Thank you, Warwick. They're great comments, and good to get your sort of view around what's happening on the ground, given your experience with Central West Orana. I guess I heard a vote for a transmission delay sensitivity, at least. But I guess just to comment on, you know, there's lots in that, lots for our roadmap partners to address as well, particularly Energy Co. But just to say, with the modelling that we do, we have up-to-date assumptions that we get from Energy Co. So while we use AEMO's assumptions primarily, the assumptions that we make around the costs and timing of energy transmission infrastructure, the RESs and the priority transmission infrastructure projects, we source those from Energy Co, and so it's their best view of the costs and timing at the time that we do the model, and then potentially we may do a further delay scenario on top of that. So yes, we do think that sensitivity is an important one. On the I guess the risk of blackouts, when we do our modelling, we are looking at the reliability impacts of different scenarios. So if we're doing say a transmission delay sensitivity, then through that modelling, we will understand, what plays out in terms of reliability. AEMO services also, once we set this development pathway and we start getting bids through our tender process, we also have a lot of insight into, well, can the market actually meet our development pathway at the costs we thought they could. So we are getting a lot of these insights around what we think should work and what the reliability outcomes are, then what the market actually tells us. So AEMO service is actually in a really good position to identify some of these risks early. And that is why, we do have sort of advice functions under the roadmap. That means we are able to provide input into both the Minister and Energy Co as the infrastructure planner if they do request that advice. But yeah, there's a lot of information that we do have, so we are in a good position to be able to inform about those risks as they arise.
Thanks, Billy. Just one point to add, and it's a changing scenarios all the time. Like only yesterday, I think it was, the Energy Minister in New South Wales announced an upper house inquiry into the costs and benefits of undergrounding all the major transmission lines, proposed transmission lines in New South Wales. That report is due out at the end of August. So I'm not sure what that's going to unleash, but a question mark on that matter, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Warwick. We might move on, but thank you for your contribution. We might move on to some of the other questions now, Elizabeth, focusing on the sensitivities. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. Praveen, are you around and happy to come on and post your question, or would you like me to do it for you?
Yeah. Thanks for those insights. Yeah, I'm more interested in the scenarios, like how and the sensitivities, what's being considered in the central case of the most likely scenario, like how frequently it's being updated, so that's actually feeding into this LTSS and long duration storage tender assessments. So that's what I'm curious about. Is it like the base scenario is still like a no roadmap scenario, or is it being updated to reflect the updates to the market?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one in the first instance. So around the central scenario, maybe just to the last bit of your question there, Praveen, it does include in the IIO report, all of our scenarios would include sort of the minimum legislative objectives that we have to hit, and it's questions that we would the nature of the questions we would be trying to answer through the modelling would be, how can we achieve those minimum objectives in a way that minimises cost to consumers? In terms of the assumptions that we use in the central scenario, they are updated regularly. And so at the time of modelling, for example, at the time of modelling for the draft 2023 IIO report, and when we get to sort of kick off of modelling for the final, we will use the latest information available from AEMO, including, so around, I think part of your question was around generation assets and sort of updates to developments. For example, one of the sources of information on that around what is currently at this point in time existing or committed or anticipated by AEMO is the generation information page. And so our modelling would be considering the latest information on that at the time of modelling. It is worth noting that modelling is time consuming, and almost with any exercise, by the time that we complete the modelling, there is new information that arises that we weren't able to consider at the beginning of the modelling exercise. And so we do use the latest information all the time, noting that there's always going to be certain elements that change, and it's sort of just a matter of understanding what would the likely impact of those changes be on the key variables of interest for us, such as the development pathway and how we plan our tenders and the cost to consumers. Some of the other information sources that we use, a lot of it would be coming from AEMO's latest view around sort of things to do with technology costs and demand forecasts, and those assumptions would be whatever is available at the time from AEMO. And so, for example, the assumptions from the 2020 that we used for the 2022 ISP were largely the assumptions we aligned with for the draft. We know that a lot of those assumptions will be updated through the 2023 ISR that Dan was talking through in time for our final IIO report. And so we will be looking to use the latest information on our view around the central or most likely assumptions that are available from AEMO at the time. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, but is there like a set frequency, or is it like whenever the information is available? Like, because the market is so dynamic at this point of time, like the wind project costs are going over the roof. That would have been a different case previously.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the sort of frequency or the cadence of our IIO report. IIO reports would typically be every 2 years, although we've also got a draft in this instance, so sort of twice in the same year in this instance. But we do also have a principle of where there is better information or later information than what has been assumed most recently in AEMO's modelling. We can update that. So, for example, at the time of the 2023 draft IIO report modelling, we did feel that there was a need to update the fuel price forecasts, and that is something that we did sort of go out and update as an input for that particular report. Some of the, and I guess that was informed by the particular sort of market outcomes at the time of modelling and sort of what was going on with gas prices mid last year, which we felt that we needed to update. It would be a case by case basis, but the general cadence would be every 2 years, and it would be a dovetailing cadence with the process that AEMO takes with their updating of input assumptions for the ISP. And so some of it will be aligned, some of it will be different, and it will also depend on the market outcomes at that point in time.
I'm just curious about the next thing, like about a scenario where, because there's a lot of delays we are hearing from the market around increasing chances of blackouts and all those stuff. So in case a scenario arises where some government needs to step in and prioritize some of those projects and move them into their priority transmission projects, is there a scenario or a sensitivity being carried to look at what will be the risk for the market perspective?
Raveen, I might interject here. We are unfortunately running out of time. We're happy to set up a separate meeting to discuss these things with you and have a bit more of a one-on-one Q&A kind of session so that you can continue to ask any questions. I'll extend that invitation out to everybody on the call as well. If there are more questions that you would like to ask and you would like to have a meeting with the team, we're more than happy to facilitate that. Paul, apologies, we haven't been able to get to your question today. We will respond to all of the questions again in writing and post them onto our website within due course. If anyone wants anything else, please feel free to send a submission through to the email address that I've just popped in the chat. The address is iioReport@aemoservices.com.au, and a reminder that the feedback closes on the 30th of June. So with that, thank you so much to all of our presenters today, and thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks all.